Every year, millions of people travel to England to see the countryside. They come for the green, the impossible, saturated, ancient-looking green of hills that seem to have been standing exactly like this since before memory. They come for the hedgerows and the church towers and the sheep on the hillsides and the particular silence of a landscape that feels, in some deep and wordless way, like it has never been touched. Like it grew this way, like it has always been exactly this. Turner painted it. Wordsworth wept over it. The whole of the 19th century decided it was the closest thing on earth to paradise. They were looking at a crime scene. Under that grass, under the famous, beloved, endlessly painted English countryside, there are 3,000 villages. Not ruins, not archaeological sites, carefully roped off and explained. The actual shapes of houses, pressed into the earth, still holding their outlines after 500 years. The lanes, the garden plots, the foundations of churches that once had congregations. All of it buried under the most celebrated landscape in the Western world, under the hedgerows and the rolling meadows, under everything every painter and every poet ever called beautiful about England. 3,000 communities, gone. Not by plague, not by flood, not by anything that could be called an act of God or a turn of fate, or the kind of slow, impersonal tide that history is usually blamed on. By a decision, made by a specific group of men, for a specific reason. In the 14th and 15th centuries, English wool was the most valuable export in Europe. Flemish weavers needed it. Italian merchants paid fortunes for it. And England's landowning nobility, the lords who held legal title over vast stretches of the country, looked at their estates and made a calculation. For centuries, those estates had been alive, villages of people who had worked the same land since before anyone could remember farming it, living on it, burying their dead in it. They had rights to that land, customary, stubborn, centuries-old rights, and they were difficult to move. Sheep were not. One shepherd, 1,000 animals, and wool, sold to the continent, returned more profit than grain ever had. The calculation was simple: clear the people, fence the land, run the sheep. The people were not removed out of hatred. They were removed because, measured against the price of wool on a foreign market, they were worth less than the animals that replaced them. Around the year 1500, a man named Baron Hilton ordered the last 4 families removed from a village called Warham Percy. Their houses, buildings that had stood for centuries, on land their families had worked for generations, were knocked down, not left to decay, knocked down, so they could not come back. Within a generation, 1,200 sheep grazed on that ground, tended by 2 men. A witness, asked about the village years later, described what had happened in 5 words. The town was laid to grass. Across England, from Yorkshire to Dorset, from the 14th century to the 18th, the same sentence, 3,000 times over. A town laid to grass, a community converted to pasture. Families with names and histories and legal rights removed because a group of men with the law in their hands decided that wool was worth more than people. And then, and this is the part that should stop you cold, the landscape that resulted was declared the most beautiful in the world, painted, celebrated, exported to every corner of the earth as a vision of ancient, natural, unspoiled England. The grass grew over the houses. The poets arrived. This is the story of how England's landowning nobility cleared 3,000 communities from the land, built a paradise on top of them, and convinced the rest of the world to call it timeless. But to understand what was destroyed, you first have to see it alive. The field where Warham Percy stood is green and quiet this morning. It has been green and quiet for 500 years. The grass grows thick and uninterrupted across the shallow Yorkshire Valley, broken only by the ruined church at the bottom of the slope and the long, low ridges that run across the hillside in parallel lines, the outlines of houses pressed into the earth, still holding their shape after half a millennium of weather and silence. But this is not that morning. This is a morning in the early 14th century, when Warham Percy is not a field but a village, and a village, in medieval England, is one of the loudest places on earth. Before the sun is fully up, the bell in the church tower has already rung twice. The first ring was prime, the canonical hour of dawn, the signal that the night watch is over and the day has begun. The second was the work bell, the one that matters more to most people here, the one that gets bodies out of beds and onto the land. Church time and field time are not always the same thing in a medieval village, but they are both real, both binding. The bells organize everything. Agnes, a villager, a widow, somewhere in her 40s, the kind of woman who has survived enough hard winters to have stopped being surprised by hardship, is already outside. She has been up since before prime, which is not unusual. There is always something that needs doing before the official day begins. This morning it is the 2 goats, who share the small enclosure behind her house with 3 chickens and a pig that is getting fat enough to be worth thinking about. The goats get grain, the chickens scatter. The pig ignores her, which is what pigs do. Her house is 1 room and a loft, timber frame, wattle and daub walls, a thatched roof that needs attention on the east side where the rain has been finding its way in since October. The floor is packed, earth covered with rushes. There is a central hearth with no chimney. The smoke goes up through a hole in the roof, or mostly up, or in the direction of up, on the days when the wind is cooperative. In winter, the animals come inside. It is warmer that way, for everyone. This is not a romantic picture of medieval life. It is a cold, hard physical existence in which the margin between enough and not enough is narrow enough that a single bad harvest becomes a matter of survival. Agnes knows this. Everyone in this village knows this. It is the organizing fact of every decision they make. And yet, the village is alive in a way that is worth understanding before we watch it die. Walk down the lane that runs through the center of Warham Percy, a hollow way, worn a foot deep into the earth by centuries of feet and cartwheels, and what you find is not poverty, but a functioning civilization in miniature. There is the mill at the bottom of the valley, beside the stream, grinding grain into flour since before anyone alive can remember. There is the church, which is also the village's record office, its courthouse, its community hall, the place where marriages are made legal and deaths are registered and disputes are settled under the eye of God and the priest. There is the manor house, where the Lord Steward lives. The Lord himself is rarely here, being the kind of man who has several manors and visits each one seasonally. Like a problem, he rotates. There are 40 households, 200 or 300 people, all of whom know each other's names, histories, grievances, and the exact dimensions of each other's strips of land. Those strips are the key to everything. The open field system, the way Warham, Percy, and thousands of villages like it organize their land, is not a simple thing. 3 large fields surround the village, each one several hundred acres. Each field is divided into long, narrow strips, a furlong each, separated by unplowed balks of earth. Every household in the village holds strips scattered across all 3 fields, not concentrated in one place, but distributed, so that the good soil and the poor soil, the south-facing slope and the north-facing slope, the strip near the water and the strip far from it, are shared out as fairly as the land allows. 2 of the 3 fields are planted each year. The third lies fallow, resting, recovering, being grazed by the village animals whose dung feeds it for the following year. Then the rotation shifts. The system has been running this way since before the Normans came, since before the Saxons, in some places since before anyone thought to write anything down. It is, by the 14th century, the closest thing England's rural poor have to security, not wealth, not comfort, but a system of mutual dependency that makes individual survival possible. You cannot starve alone in an open field village. Everyone's bad year is everyone's problem. That collective resilience is precisely what makes it, to a man watching from outside it with a ledger in his hand, an obstacle. Agnes holds 6 strips across the 3 fields. She inherited 4 of them from her husband, who who died of a fever 11 years ago during a wet summer that killed more people than she likes to think about. She acquired the other two by a combination of quiet negotiation and the kind of social credit that accrues over decades to a woman who knows how to be useful. The strips are not large. Each one is enough to produce, in a good year, enough grain to feed a family and pay the rent and have a small surplus for the autumn market. In a bad year, they are not enough. Everyone here knows what a bad year looks like. But here is the thing about Agnes's strips. The thing that is easy to miss if you are looking at this world from the outside and thinking of it as primitive or precarious or replaceable. Her right to those strips is as legally real and as socially recognized as anything in England. The custom of the manor, the unwritten law that governs who holds what, who owes what, who may do what on which piece of ground is not a polite fiction. It is enforceable. It has been enforced for generations. A lord cannot simply take Agnes's strips without cause. A medieval lord, the law says, cannot evict a tenant without legal justification. Cannot, the law says. Beyond the strips, there is the common. The pasture at the edge of the village where the animals of every household graze together, Agnes's 2 goats among them, alongside the oxen that 5 households share for plowing, the cows, the geese, the occasional horse. The common is not empty wasteland. It is managed, carefully, by the village court that meets 4 times a year in the churchyard to settle disputes, set grazing limits, fine anyone who overstocks the pasture or encroaches on a neighbor's strip or lets their pigs root up the balks between fields. The court has no great legal standing in the wider world. But in this village, its judgments are the law that people actually live by. There is woodland, too, at the upper edge of the parish, where Agnes has the right to gather dead wood for fuel, not living wood, not timber, but fallen branches and deadfall, which is enough to keep a single-room house from freezing through a Yorkshire winter if you know what you are doing and start gathering early enough in autumn. She knows what she is doing. She has been doing it her whole life. This web of rights, the strips, the common grazing, the wood gathering, the mill access, the use of the village oven, is not charity. It is not the generosity of the Lord. It is custom. It is the accumulated social contract of a community that has been making collective survival possible on this particular piece of land for somewhere between 300 and 600 years. It is, in the language of a later and more brutal century, an inefficiency waiting to be corrected. Agnes does not know this yet. She is thinking about the east side of her roof and the pig, and whether the youngest of her grandchildren has shaken the fever that has been worrying her daughter for the past week. She is not thinking about wool prices in Bruges, or the mathematics of sheep versus grain, or the question of whether the customary rights of English peasants are an obstacle to someone else's profit. Why would she? The village has been here since her grandmother's grandmother was a child. The strips have been worked, the bell has rung, the mill has turned, the court has met. The dead have been buried in the churchyard, just beyond the church wall, generation after generation. In an unbroken line that stretches back further than memory, the world feels, from inside it, like the kind of thing that simply continues. It will not continue. Somewhere in England, in a manor house, the residents of Warham Percy have probably never seen. In a room they will never enter, a man is looking at a ledger. He is not looking at Agnes. He does not know her name, but he is looking at her village, at the land it sits on, at what that land produces, and what it could produce under a different arrangement. He is doing arithmetic. This is how it always begins, not with violence, not with hatred, with a number on a page, and a man who has the legal power to act on it. But before he acts, before the ledgers win and the lawyers arrive and the first house comes down, something else comes first. Something that will be blamed for centuries, for everything that follows. Something that is, in truth, only the first wound. In the summer of 1348, a ship docked at the small port of Melcombe Regis on the Dorset coast. The men who walked off that ship looked ordinary enough. sailors from Gascony, crossing the channel in the normal course of trade. Nobody on the dock that morning would have had any reason to look at them twice. The harvest was beginning across the fields of southern England. Life was proceeding in the grinding rhythm of the agricultural year, the same rhythm Agnes and every village like hers had lived by for centuries. What those sailors carried had already killed a third of Europe. It arrived with no announcement and no visible form and no logic that anyone could name. It was just something that happened to your neighbor, a fever, then swellings, black and hard and agonizing, erupting at the groin and armpit. 3 days, usually. Some lasted 4. A monk named John of Reading described what those days looked like. Ulcers breaking out in the groin and armpit, he wrote, which tortured the dying. And then, as a chronicler named Robert of Avesbury recorded with terrible plainness, it removed them from human concerns in the course of a morning. A morning, that is all it took. By autumn of 1348, the plague had reached London. By summer 1349, it covered the entire country, moving north, through the Midlands, into Yorkshire, reaching the villages of the Wolds somewhere in early spring. It traveled at walking pace, roughly the speed a person moves through a landscape, because that is exactly how it moved. Person to person, village to village, in the breath and blood of people who had no idea they were carrying it. The monk Henry of Knighton watched it pass through Leicester and wrote down what he saw. Many villages and hamlets, he recorded, have now become quite desolate. No one is left in the houses, for the people are dead that once inhabited them. No one is left in the houses. Think about what that sentence means inside a world built the way Agnes's was. The open field system ran on bodies. 8 households sharing a team of oxen for the plowing. The widow who gathered wood because the man who once gathered it was gone. The miller, the priest, the reeve who kept the accounts. Remove half of them in a single season, and the machinery of collective survival begins to seize. Fields go unplowed, harvests rot, animals wander untended across strips that nobody is left to claim. The system that had made survival possible for centuries required people to function. The plague removed the people. Between 1/3 and 1/2 of England's population died. In some villages, everyone. This is the story the world has always told. The plague as the great eraser, a catastrophe so total, so biblical, that it explains everything that came after. Ask almost anyone why the medieval villages of England are empty today, and this is the answer you will receive. The Black Death, an act of God, nobody's fault. It is the convenient explanation. And it is, in most cases, wrong. Here is what the archaeology shows. The researchers who spent 40 years excavating Warham Percy alongside the historians who mapped the desertion dates of thousands of empty English villages found something that does not fit this story. Most of England's deserted medieval villages were not abandoned in the 1340s and 1350s, during or immediately after the Black Death. They were abandoned in the 1400s and 1500s. A full century, sometimes 2, after the plague had passed. Warham Percy itself survived. By 1368, 20 years after the worst of it, the village still had 30 occupied houses, a working mill, productive fish ponds, smaller than before. But alive, breathing, still there. What finished it came later, and it wore a human face. Here is the part of the plague story that almost never gets told, because it complicates the simple narrative of catastrophe that history finds so much more comfortable than the truth. For the peasants who survived the Black Death, the immediate aftermath was, in certain measurable ways, the best period their families had known in centuries. With half the labor force dead, the survivors could suddenly demand higher wages. Lords who had spent generations keeping peasants bound to the land by custom and statute now desperately needed workers, and workers, for the first time, could negotiate. Food prices fell because there were fewer mouths competing for the same supply. Land became available. In some villages, peasant families who had spent their entire lives hovering at subsistence found themselves, for the first time, with enough. A ploughman's weekly wage at Cuxham jumped from 2 shillings before the plague to 10 shillings by 1350. That is a 5-fold increase in a single year. For men and women who had never in their lives had leverage over anything, it must have felt extraordinary. The landowning nobility understood exactly what this meant. A peasant with options is a peasant who cannot be controlled. So in 1349, while the plague was still moving north through England, Edward III issued a royal ordinance. 2 years later, in 1351, Parliament formalized it into law, the Statute of Labourers. The Statute of Labourers froze wages at their 1,346 levels, the levels of before the plague, the levels of when the lords held all the cards. It made it a criminal offense for any peasant to seek better pay or leave their village without permission. It required every able-bodied person under 60 to accept whatever work was offered at whatever wage the lord chose to pay. Those who refused could be imprisoned. Those who ran were to be brought back. Listen to that again slowly. The plague had killed half the people. The survivors had tried to improve their lives. Edward III passed a law to stop them at the direct urging of the landowning nobility, whose petition to Parliament complained, without apparent shame, about the malice of servants who were idle and not willing to serve without excessive wages. Malice, the word they used for a peasant who wanted to be paid fairly for his labor. This is who is governing England in 1351. These are the men, the same class of men, the same landowning nobility, who petitioned Edward III, who sat in Parliament, who wrote the statute and enforced it and jailed people under it, who will spend the next 2 centuries clearing the villages the plague failed to empty. The plague is not innocent in this story. It weakened villages, reduced populations, made communities economically fragile in ways that took generations to recover. In some places, it pushed settlements that were already struggling past the point of no return. The plague is the wound. It is real. It deserves the grief history has given it. But a wound is not a killing blow. The killing blow is deliberate, calculated, patient. It is the men who wrote the Statute of Labourers in 1351, now emboldened, now with the law firmer in their grip, watching their estates in the wake of the plague, and doing the same arithmetic that Agnes's village had no idea was being done. Wool prices rising. Villages smaller and more vulnerable than they were before 1348. Legal tools sharpened. The machinery for dispossession already running about to shift into a different gear entirely. Some of England's most famous meadows are grass today, not because a disease swept through them 6 centuries ago, but because a specific man, in the 1400s or 1500s, looked at the village on his land and made a decision. The plague has been covering for him ever since. And now, with the wound named and the plague's cover pulled away, it is time to watch exactly what he did. In 1516, a man named Thomas More published a book. More was a lawyer, a scholar, an advisor to Henry VIII, a man who moved in the highest circles of English power and understood exactly how the machinery of wealth and governance worked, because he had spent his life inside it. The book was called Utopia. It imagined a perfect society on a fictional island, and the contrast it drew between that imagined world and the real one. More was watching from his window, was not philosophical. It was a prosecution. In the middle of the book, More stopped to describe something he had witnessed with his own eyes, something that was happening across England while he wrote. He reached for the sharpest image available to a man of his intelligence and moral seriousness, and what he wrote was this: "Your sheep, that were wont to be so meek and tame, have become so great devourers and so wild that they eat up and swallow down the very men themselves. They consume, destroy, and devour whole fields, houses, and cities." He meant it literally. The sheep were not metaphorical. The devouring was not a figure of speech. More was describing a specific mechanism that had been running for 100 years, dismantling villages, removing families, demolishing houses. converting the land that communities had worked for centuries into private pasture for a single profitable animal. It had a name. It had legal instruments behind it. It had beneficiaries who were wealthy and powerful and entirely aware of what they were doing. The mechanism was called enclosure, and to understand what it did to the people it touched, you have to watch it work. Start with a village that is still alive. Not Warham Percy, yet a village somewhere in the English Midlands. In the late 1300s, a generation after the plague, the worst of the dying is over. The village is smaller than it was 40 families where there were once 60, 30 where there were 40, but it is functioning. The strips are being worked. The common is being grazed. The church bell is ringing. The system that Agnes's world ran on, the open field system with its mutual dependencies and its centuries-old customary rights, is still holding. The lord of this village has a problem. His estate produces grain. Grain requires labor plowing, planting, weeding, harvesting, threshing, storing. All of it done by the families in the village, in exchange for the right to work their own strips and graze their animals on the common. It is the arrangement that has governed this relationship since before anyone can remember, and it costs him. In wages, in the obligation to maintain the customary rights, in the grinding negotiation of a system that requires the cooperation of dozens of people to function. Across the Channel, the wool merchants of Bruges and Florence are paying fortunes for English fleece. The price has been climbing for decades. One shepherd and a dog can manage 1,000 sheep on the land that 50 farming families currently occupy. The math is not complicated. The Lord does not need to be cruel or even particularly callous to arrive at the same conclusion that lords across England are arriving at simultaneously, in their own manners, in their own private arithmetic. He needs the people gone. But here is the obstacle, the thing that makes enclosure a process rather than a single act. The families in that village have rights, not rights in the modern bureaucratic sense, not documents filed with a government office, customary rights. The right to graze 2 sheep on the common, to gather deadwood from the upper woodland, to use the mill, to work the strips that have been in the family for generations. These rights are not written down because they do not need to be written down. They are enforced by the village court. They are older than any lord's claim to the estate. They are, in the understanding of the people who hold them, as permanent as the land itself. A medieval lord cannot simply evict a tenant without legal cause. The law says so. The custom says so. More than that, the community says so. These people know each other. They have been neighbors for generations. They will resist collectively any attempt to take what is theirs. So the Lord does not come for the village directly. He comes for the conditions that make the village viable. He converts the common pasture to private sheep run fencing it off, so the families can no longer graze their animals there. The widow who depended on those 2 sheep on the common has lost her margin. The family whose ox grazed there through the winter cannot keep the ox through the cold months without it. He encloses the woodland, cutting off the fuel supply. He raises the rents on the strips to a level that the reduced post-plague population cannot sustain. He lets the mill fall into disrepair, so grain cannot be ground. He makes each individual arrangement slightly worse, slightly more difficult, slightly less survivable, not all at once, which would be obvious, but one by one, over years, over decades. Each small change, individually deniable, has misfortune or necessity, and the families, one by one, leave. Not because they want to, because they have been made to. Because the system that made their survival possible has been systematically dismantled around them, piece by piece, until what remains is not a village, but a collection of people with nowhere left to stand. This is the mechanism. This is how 3,000 villages died, not in a night, over decades of patient, deliberate, entirely rational dispossession. The Hilton family acquired the manor of Warham Percy sometime between 1394 and 1402, a transfer of title, the kind of event noted in a document and forgotten. The families in the village would not have chosen it. They were not consulted. The land changed hands above their heads, and the new lord was simply the fact they woke up to. At first, nothing dramatic happened. In 1436, 16 houses were still occupied. The village was smaller than it had been, weakened by the aftermath of the plague and the long pressure of the 1400s, but it was alive. Then the Hiltons began. Through the 1440s and 1450s, the conversion began quietly. Farmland to pasture, common rights progressively restricted, families leaving not in a single mass eviction, but in the slow hemorrhage of a community being made impossible from within. By the 1450s, there was a sharp fall in population. By the 1480s, the village was nearly empty. The process had taken 50 years. It did not need to be dramatic. It just needed to be patient. But patience has a final act. Around 1,500, the records date it loosely, somewhere between 1,488 and 1,506. William Baron Hilton gave an order. The last 4 families remaining at Warham Percy were to be removed, and their houses were to be knocked down. Not abandoned, knocked down. The walls that had stood for centuries, the hearths lit every winter since before anyone alive could remember, the door frames that children had measured themselves against taken apart. The demolition was not cruelty for its own sake. It was practical. An empty house can be reoccupied. An occupied house asserts rights. Rights complicate titles. The only way to ensure the people would not come back was to ensure there was nothing left to come back to. By 1527, a generation after the last families were removed, Baron Hilton had converted every remaining arable strip at Warham Percy to pasture. And by 1543, a man named John Thorpe of Appleton was running 1,200 sheep on the ground where those houses had stood, 1,200 animals, 2 shepherds, a village that had housed and buried 200 to 300 people for 6 centuries, reduced in a single generation to a flock and 2 men with sticks. In 1555, a legal dispute broke out over the rebuilding of the village vicarage, which had burned down. Witnesses were called. The court asked about the village. A man named Robert Pickering from the neighboring settlement of Raysthorpe gave his answer in plain English. The town, he said, was laid to grass 28 years since. 5 words for 6 centuries. The flatness of that sentence is itself a kind of violence. Robert Pickering said it the way you say something that is simply true and has been true long enough that it no longer needs to feel like anything. Now hold that sentence, the town was laid to grass, and walk across England with it. Because Warham Percy is one story, there are 3,000 more. In Northamptonshire, a county in the English Midlands where the soil was particularly suited to sheep, the evidence is overwhelming. The village of Muscot paid the highest tax in the county in 1334, a thriving community, prosperous enough to sit above every neighboring settlement in the assessment rolls. By 1377, only 5 people paid the poll tax there. By 1547, 300 sheep grazed its fields. The math of what happened in between those dates requires no interpretation. At Wolfhampcote, the Lord cleared the village and left the church of St. Peter standing alone in a field where it stands today roofless, used once or twice a year by a conservation trust, surrounded by nothing but the bumps in the ground that were once a neighborhood. Local legend says the village was wiped out by the Black Death. The archaeology says otherwise. It is much more likely that a few families struggled on after the plague and then, one by one, the conditions of their survival were removed until the Lord could clear what little remained. At Firth, though, the whole village was depopulated by enclosure. A dovecote and a medieval church survived. The church is still there. Where the people went is not recorded. These are not exceptional cases. These are representative ones. Across England, in county after county, the same pattern repeats. A village present in the Domesday Book of 1086, taxed and recorded and alive through the medieval centuries, and then somewhere between 1,400 and 1,600 gone, not destroyed by plague or flood or war, made impossible, cleared, the land converted. The argument is not in the absence of the villages. It is in the timing 100 years after the plague, 200 years, the same mechanism still running, the same calculation still being made. And above every cleared village, without exception, in the first generation after the families were gone sheep. Here is what the cleared landscape looks like from inside it, in the years immediately after. The houses are down, or they are standing empty, beginning to decay, their roofs thinning where the thatch is not replaced, their walls crumbling where the daub is not repaired. The strips are overgrown, the precise, carefully maintained strips that a dozen families had worked for generations, each one known by its position in the field, each one part of a system of rotation that required collective coordination to function. Without the people to work them, they go to grass within a season. The common is fenced. The mill is silent. The church is still standing. This is the detail that should stop you. A church standing in an empty landscape is not a picturesque ruin. It is forensic evidence. A church is built to serve a congregation. When the congregation is gone and the church remains, it means the congregation did not leave voluntarily, because communities that dissolve naturally take their church with them, or let it fall, or repurpose the stone for something else. A church left standing in a cleared field means the community was removed faster than its physical structures could be erased. The church outlasted the people it was built to serve because the people were taken away and the stone was simply left behind. There are dozens of these churches across England. Each one is standing in the approximate center of what was once a village. Each one is surrounded by the same low ridges in the grass that Warham Percy has the foundations of houses, the lines of lanes, the shape of gardens that have not been gardens for 500 years. The ridges are called ridge and furrow. They are the physical memory of the open field system, the strips, still legible in the contours of the ground, still holding the shape of the work that was done in them centuries after the last hand touched them. Stand in one of those fields, look at the ridges. Each one is a strip. Each strip fed a family. Each family had names and children, and disputes with their neighbors over boundary lines, and a legal right customary, centuries old, entirely real to be exactly where they were. They were not removed by God or nature or the slow drift of history. They were removed by a man with a legal instrument and a calculation about wool prices. And the calculation held, and now there is grass. Cardinal Wolsey saw it. In 1517, the year after, More published Utopia. While More's ink was barely dry on his description of sheep-devouring men, Henry VIII's chief minister launched a national inquiry into illegal enclosures. Wolsey sent commissioners across England to investigate, to count the destroyed houses, to document the cleared villages. The inquiry found violations everywhere it looked. Lords were summoned to account. Some were ordered to rebuild the houses they had demolished, to restore the arable land they had converted. Wolsey framed it plainly. The poor had been driven from their homes, the law had been broken, and the law would be enforced. And then the nobles pushed back. The nobles who had been ordered to rebuild paid small fines, or composed quietly with Wolsey's office, or simply waited. By 1523, 6 years after the inquiry began, Wolsey was forced to accept all existing enclosures. The investigation that had found illegal clearances across the country was quietly buried. The lords were the same men who sat in Parliament. They were the same men the king depended on to govern and to fund his wars. The machinery of justice existed precisely to give the appearance of redress, while the substance of it was denied. This is the mechanism completed. Not just the clearing of villages, but the legal architecture that made the clearing possible. The court system that found the violations and then accepted the fines and moved on. The parliament that wrote the laws and the nobles who ignored them, and the king who ultimately sided with the property over the people. 3,000 villages did not disappear because the law failed to notice. They disappeared because the law was structured, from top to bottom, to protect the people who were doing the clearing. Thomas More understood this. He had sat at the same tables as the men who owned the sheep. He wrote about them devouring men from inside the court that gave them impunity. He was executed by Henry VIII in 1535 for reasons that had nothing to do with enclosure. But the image he chose, the most extreme image available to a man of his intelligence, was not a tyrant. Not a weapon, a sheep, moving across a field that used to be a village, grazing on the grass that had grown over everything. 3,000 villages. Say it slowly and mean it. 3,000. Not 3,000 ruins, 3,000 absences. Communities whose entire physical existence was so thoroughly removed that most have no names in common memory. You cannot visit them. You cannot stand in their market squares or walk their main streets. The graves are there, under the grass, but the stones were taken for building material or sank into the earth over the centuries. What remains are the shapes. At Wareham, Percy, 40 houses, 2 manor houses. The outline of the mill, the fish pond, the lane that ran down the center of the village, worn a foot deep into the chalk by centuries of feet, still visible as a hollow in the ground. And in the churchyard, the bones of nearly 700 people, children who died young, women whose skeletons show bones more muscular than their city counterparts from a lifetime of physical labor, men and women who survived tuberculosis and kept working, whose bodies carry in their density and their damage the specific weight of the lives they lived. Those people have no names in any surviving document. The only record of their existence is the shape of the ground they shaped, the ridges where they plowed, the hollow where they walked, the earth itself carrying the memory of them, because nothing else did. 600 years of living on a piece of land, a decision made by one man in one generation, measured against the price of wool. And then the grass. What the histories rarely mention what gets buried under the pastoral beauty of the countryside that replaced these people is what came next. The cleared families did not simply go. The evicted communities did not simply accept the calculation that had been made about their worth. For 300 years they fought back, with their bodies, with their tools, with proclamations written in their own blood. That is the part of this story almost nobody knows. On the morning of the 9th of July, 1549, a group of men in the Norfolk village of Wymondham began tearing down fences. The fences had been put up by local landowners who had enclosed common land, land that families in Wymondham and the surrounding villages had grazed their animals on for generations, gathered wood from, depended on in the way that people depend on the thing that stands between them and starvation. The fences said, "This is mine now." The men with the tools said, "No, it isn't." One of the landowners whose fences were targeted that morning was a man named Robert Kett. He came out to confront the group. He listened to what they told him, and then Robert Kett did something that no one expected, least of all the men who had come to tear down his property. He helped them pull his own fences down. More than that, he became their leader. He had enclosed that common land himself. He knew it was wrong. He said so. And then he walked with them toward Norwich, the second largest city in England, as more and more people joined the march from every village they passed through. By the time they reached Mousehold Heath, on the high ground overlooking Norwich, they numbered 16,000. 16,000 people. Let that settle for a moment. This was not a riot. It was not a spontaneous outburst of anger. The camp on Mousehold Heath was larger than the city it overlooked. Kett established a council under an oak tree. They called it the Oak of Reformation, and ran the camp as a functioning community. Food supplies organized, order maintained, a system of warrants issued for provisions. They drew up a list of 29 demands and sent it to the Lord Protector in London. Among them, that no lord of the manor should be able to exploit common land, that tenant rights be protected, that the enclosures be reversed. They were not asking for revolution. They were asking for the law to be applied to the people who were breaking it. The government's first response was to send a royal herald to offer a pardon. Kett's response to the pardon was precise and unambiguous. He had committed no treason, he said. He had broken no laws. It was not he who needed a pardon. The herald declared him a rebel. Ket's men stormed Norwich the following day and took the city. The first army sent to retake it under the Marquis of Northampton was defeated. Beaten in the streets of Norwich by farmers and laborers armed with pitchforks and longbows. The government, shaken in a way it had not expected to be, sent a second army, 12,000 men under John Dudley, the Earl of Warwick. German and Italian mercenaries, among them professional soldiers, because the English troops in the area could not be fully trusted to fight against their own neighbors. The battle at Dussendale, on the 27th of August, 1549, ended the rebellion. 3,000 of Ket's followers were killed. Robert Ket was captured, taken to the Tower of London, tried for treason, and transported back to Norwich for execution. He was hanged in chains from the walls of Norwich Castle and left there, his body visible from the streets below, a warning addressed to anyone watching. His brother William was hanged from the tower of Wymondham Abbey, the church of their hometown, the place where it had all begun. But here is what the execution does not tell you. 16,000 people chose to be on Mousehold Heath, not conscripted, not bribed, not coerced. They walked there, from villages across Norfolk and Suffolk, carrying their tools and their grievances and their absolute clarity about what had been done to them and why it was wrong. They set up a council. They governed themselves. They put the gentry on trial under the Oak of Reformation and found them guilty of enclosing land illegally, which most of them were. They held Norwich, the second city of England, for 6 weeks. This was not ignorance or desperation expressing itself as violence. This was people who understood the argument precisely, who could articulate it in writing, who had sent it to the government in a list of 29 demands, making the choice to act on it with their bodies when the legal channels had failed them. Ket's rebellion was the largest single uprising against enclosure in English history. It was not the only one. Go back further to 1381, to the uprising history calls the Peasants' Revolt. Most accounts of the Peasants' Revolt frame it as a reaction to the poll tax. The tax was real, and it was the immediate trigger. But underneath the tax, running through every village that produced rebels that year, was the same pressure that would clear 3,000 villages over the following 2 centuries. The extinguishing of customary rights, the enclosure of common land, the slow conversion of the world that peasants had built and maintained into an asset class for the men above them. The rebels who marched on London in 1381 burned the legal records, specifically, deliberately. They went to the places where the documents of villenage were kept, the records that defined their servitude, that tied them to particular lords, that could be produced in court, to prove that they had no rights worth defending, and they burned them. They understood, with perfect clarity, that the law was a weapon being used against them, and they attacked the weapon. That uprising was crushed too. Its leader, Wat Tyler, was killed at a meeting with the king, stabbed by the Lord Mayor of London while negotiating. The promises made to the rebels by Richard II were rescinded within weeks. The pattern holds across 3 centuries. It holds so consistently that it becomes impossible to read it as anything other than a structure. In 1607, 58 years after Ket's rebellion, more than 200 years after the enclosures began, the Midland Revolt erupted across Northamptonshire, Warwickshire, and Leicestershire. 5,000 people gathered at Coatsbach in Leicestershire, 3,000 at Hillmorton in Warwickshire. Their leader was a tinker from Desborough named John Reynolds, who called himself Captain Pouch. He claimed the contents of the leather pouch he wore at his side would protect his followers from all harm. When he was captured and the pouch was opened, it contained a piece of green cheese. The rebellion was that kind of thing, partly organized, partly desperate, partly held together by the charisma of a man who carried a pouch of cheese and told people God was on their side. But the words they wrote were not desperate. In a declaration produced during the revolt, the diggers of Warwickshire, to all other diggers, they said they would prefer to die manfully than hereafter, to be pined to death for want of that which those devouring encroachers. serve their fat hogs and sheep withal. Listen to that statement and hear what it is. Not a cry of confusion, not a plea for mercy. A statement of precise moral consciousness from people who knew exactly what the encroachers were doing, who understood that it was a choice being made at their expense, and who had decided that dying on their feet was preferable to dying slowly of a hunger that had been manufactured for someone else's profit. 40 to 50 of them were killed at Newton when the gentry's forces charged the crowd. The leaders were hanged and quartered, their bodies displayed at Northampton and Oundle as warnings. Captain Pouch's pouch, it turned out, contained only cheese. And then, in 1649, 42 years after the Midland Revolt, the English Civil War newly over, the king beheaded. The old order cracked open for the first time. A small cloth merchant from London named Garrard Winstanley took a spade and went to St. George's Hill in Surrey and began to dig. He brought 30 or 40 people with him. They planted parsnips, carrots, and beans on the common land. They called themselves the True Levelers. They wrote a manifesto and sent it to every corner of England. The earth, Winstanley wrote, was hedged into enclosures by the teachers and rulers, and the others were made servants and slaves. It was not always thus. It was not meant to be thus. The earth was made to be a common treasury for all, both rich and poor, not to be bought and sold, not to be locked behind hedges for the benefit of a few, while the many starved in the shadow of fields they once had rights to. Winstanley had not come out of nowhere. He came out of 300 years of the same argument that Ket had made from Mousehold Heath, that the rebels of 1381 had made when they burned the legal records, that the diggers of Warwickshire had made when they said they would rather die. The argument was always the same, that the earth belongs to the people who live on it, and that what had been done to England's villages was a crime, not an inevitability. The landowners hired thugs to beat the diggers and burn their houses. Local clergy were employed specifically to preach against them. By April 1650, Winstanley's colony at St. George's Hill was gone. Now here is the reversal, the thing that changes the shape of everything that came before it. These people were not passive victims. The 3,000 empty villages were not emptied in silence. They were emptied over the screaming objection of people who understood precisely what was being done to them, who organized, who petitioned, who marched, who fought with their bodies and their tools and their words against a process that was killing them. The Peasants' Revolt, Ket's Rebellion, the Captain Pouch Revolts, the Diggers. These are not separate stories. They are a single argument, made generation after generation for 300 years, never won, never abandoned. The clearances did not happen because the people accepted them. They happened because the people who resisted them were killed or imprisoned or driven off by hired men with horses and swords. The enclosures were not the natural outcome of economic history. They were enforced. The countryside is not just the residue of greed. It is the residue of suppressed revolution. Every time the resistance rose, the state crushed it. The Statute of Laborers in 1351, the execution of Wat Tyler in 1381, the German mercenaries at Dussendale in 1549, the gentry's horses at Newton in 1607, the landowners' thugs burning houses on St. George's Hill in 1650. Each crushing was not the end of the argument. It was the argument being answered with force, because it could not be answered with reason. And after 1650, the resistance changes form. The large uprisings stop, not because the argument was lost, the argument was never lost, but because the memory of what happened to those who made it openly was too vivid, too recent, too embodied in the men who had been hanged from castle walls and quartered in town squares. The resistance moves underground, into poaching, into small acts of sabotage, into the quiet assertion of what had been taken, in the dark, where the horses and the hired men could not see. The lords have won, completely. The villages are gone or going. The commons are enclosed. The law is theirs. Now they will do something that no one who fought them on Mousehold Heath or dug carrots on St. George's Hill could have anticipated. They will hire artists to make all of it beautiful. In 1780, a man named Joseph Damer looked out of the window of his new mansion in Dorset and saw a town. Damer was not a modest man. Horace Walpole, who knew him well and disliked him thoroughly, described him as excessively proud and arrogant, the only basis for this being his great wealth and his marriage to a duke's daughter. He had spent years and a fortune building his new house at Milton Abbey, engaging the finest architect in England, replacing the old monastic buildings with a Gothic mansion of considerable grandeur. The grounds, he had decided, would be equally magnificent. He had already hired Lancelot Brown, the most celebrated landscape designer in England, to lay out the park. There was only one problem. The town of Middleton sat directly in his sightline. Middleton was not a ruin. It was not a shrunken medieval remnant. It was a living, functioning market town, the second largest fair in Dorset, according to a 1,334 survey, attracting buyers and sellers from across the county. It had 3 inns and a brewery, a grammar school that had been educating children since 1521, an almshouse built in 1674, a road network that made it a hub for the surrounding area. 500 people living and working in a town that had been there for over 1,000 years. Joseph Damer looked at all of this and decided it was disturbing his vision of rural peace. The demolition took 20 years. Damer could not simply evict 500 people overnight. He learned the mechanism of patience that the enclosing lords of the 14th and 15th centuries had practiced before him. He waited for leases to expire. He declined to renew them. He had the road network diverted, moving the routes that had made Middleton a hub, redirecting them away from the town so that the traffic and the commerce that depended on it began to dry up. The grammar school was relocated to Blandford Forum, 11 miles away. By the 1780s, the leases had mostly run out, and the demolition began in earnest. 150 houses, 3 inns, the brewery, the school building, the almshouses, which Damer had moved rather than demolished, presumably because their complete destruction would have been one indignity too visible even for him. All of it taken apart, cleared, the ground smoothed into parkland. Capability Brown was paid £100 for the design of the new village that replaced it. 36 identical thatched cottages in a wooded valley, a mile away, out of sight of the mansion, hidden, where Damer wouldn't have to look at the people his property required. The landscape Brown created at Milton Abbey is considered one of his finest works, a masterpiece of the pastoral rolling lawns, a serpentine lake, a specimen trees placed with the genius of a man who had spent a lifetime making designed spaces look as though no human hand had touched them. Visitors came from across England to admire it. Today it is a scheduled monument, protected by law for its outstanding aesthetic and historical significance. The historical significance being, in part, that it was built on top of a living town, demolished so that one man could have a better view. Milton Abbas is an extreme case in its specificity, a town so recently cleared, so completely documented, that its disappearance cannot be softened by time or euphemism. But the mechanism it demonstrates is not extreme at all. It is the final phase of the same process that emptied Warham Percy 3 centuries earlier, the same logic of land as a private aesthetic object, rather than a communal living space, now operating in the age of landscape. Gardening, dressed in the language of beauty and improvement, rather than the language of wool prices and legal instruments. Capability Brown worked on over 170 estates during his career. He redesigned more than 500,000 acres of England. His landscapes sit at Blenheim Palace, Chatsworth, Highclere, Harewood House, Warwick Castle, the most celebrated country houses in England, the very places that define what the English landed aristocracy looked and felt like at the height of its power. And across those estates, the same pattern repeats with a regularity that cannot be coincidence. At Bowood in Wiltshire, Brown created one of his ornamental lakes by flooding the low ground. He first removed the inhabitants who lived there. At Stowe in Buckinghamshire, the estate where Brown had begun his career as a young head gardener, the most influential landscape garden in England, the direct model for the design of Central Park in New York, the medieval village of Stowe itself had been cleared to make way for the Deer Park generations before Brown arrived. What Brown inherited and perfected there was already a landscape built on cleared ground. All that remained of the village by his time was the medieval church, standing in the gardens as an ornamental feature, a picturesque accent in a designed composition. The graves of the people who had built it somewhere in the earth, beneath the rolling lawns. The hills were leveled or moved wholesale. New valleys were cut open. Lakes appeared where there had been fields. The countryside that resulted looked effortless and eternal, as though it had always been thus, as though the smooth green parkland stretching to the horizon had never been anything else. The genius of what Brown created was not just aesthetic, it was mnemonic. He designed landscapes that looked as though they had no history. And because they looked that way, they were received that way as nature, as permanence, as the timeless face of England, when in fact they were the most recent act in a sequence of dispossession that had been running for 4 centuries. Understand what this means for the argument this video has been building. The landowning nobility cleared the villages. That was the first act. The wool prices, the legal instruments, the demolitions. The state suppressed the resistance. That was the second act. Edward III's statute, Warwick's mercenaries at Dussindale, the gentry's horses at Newton, and now the third act, the erasure of the memory of both. A crime can survive in the landscape if the landscape still shows it. The ridge and furrow at Warham Percy is visible because that particular field was never plowed after the enclosure, never built over, never redesigned. The shapes survived because nobody thought to remove them. But on the estates of the English landed aristocracy, the shapes were removed, deliberately, comprehensively. The serpentine lakes that Brown built did not appear by accident over the low ground where village houses had stood. The rolling lawns that swept to the mansion doors did not grow that way of their own accord. Hills were moved, valleys were cut. 18,000 cubic meters of earth were shifted at Stowe alone to create the Grecian Valley. The labor that went into making these landscapes look natural was itself enormous, and its primary aesthetic purpose was to make them look as though they had always been there and nothing had ever preceded them. What Thomas More saw from inside the court, in 1516, the sheep-devouring men had, by 1780, been transformed into something that painters came to capture and poets came to celebrate. The same land, the same ownership, the same class of men who had run the calculation about wool prices and sent in the mercenaries at Dussindale, now they were commissioning art. And the art worked. Turner painted these landscapes. Constable painted them. The whole of the 18th and 19th century Romantic movement in English painting took as its subject the countryside that had been designed on top of the clearances. Wordsworth walked through it and felt the presence of something ancient and permanent. The Grand Tour of England made the estates of the aristocracy destinations of pilgrimage for educated Europeans who wanted to understand what civilization looked like at its finest. The landscape was exported. The image was absorbed. By the time England's Industrial Revolution was driving millions of people into cities, the countryside they had left behind, the countryside that most of their grandparents had been pushed off through enclosure, had become the object of a nostalgia so powerful it would define English culture for 200 years. A pastoral vision of home that was, in almost every case, a vision of the land that had been taken from the families who had worked it. The poet Oliver Goldsmith understood what he was watching in 1770 when he published The Deserted Village, a poem about the clearance of a rural community, about the beauty that replaced it, about what had been lost. He looked at the hedgerows and the meadows and the gentle hills and wrote, "The man of wealth and pride takes up a space that many poor supplied." The space had been taken. What the poor had supplied was not just labor but the physical reality of a civilization, the houses, the lanes, the strips, the common, the church, the graveyard. The 600 years of continuous human presence that left ridges in the ground that nobody thought to remove because nobody thought anyone would look. Within 2 generations of the great landscaping projects, the manufactured countryside had become, in common understanding, the natural countryside. The design had succeeded so completely that the design itself had become invisible. And so the image was fixed. The rolling hills, the specimen trees, the sheep on the lawns, the church tower in the middle distance, not a crime scene, not the residue of dispossession, not the third act of a 4-century process of systematic clearance, just England, ancient, unhurried, permanent, the way it had always been. The people who built the real England, who plowed the strips and grazed the commons and rang the bell and buried their dead in the churchyard and held their rights for 6 centuries and fought and lost and fought again, became invisible too, not deliberately erased from any record, simply not part of the story that the landscape told about itself. But the earth is a better keeper of records than landscape gardeners anticipated. Under the serpentine lakes, under the rolling lawns, under the most celebrated countryside in the Western world, the ridges are still there, the houses are still there. The hollow ways still hold their shape in the soil, worn deep by centuries of feet that nobody now remembers. The grass kept everything, and if you know where to walk and what to look for, you can still read it. Walk down into the valley at Warham Percy on any morning you choose. The path drops steeply from the road, through a gate, into a fold of the Yorkshire wolds that the rest of the world seems to have forgotten. There are no signs here explaining what you are walking through. There is no visitor center, no audio guide, no interpretive panel telling you what to feel. There is a ruined church at the bottom of the slope, roofless, its tower half collapsed, the stone the color of the chalk hills it was cut from. There is a mill pond, still and dark. And there is the grass. On a summer morning, the grass is extraordinary. The light comes in low across the valley, and the field above the church is not flat. It moves. Long, slow ridges run across the hillside in parallel lines, each one slightly higher than the ground beside it, each one casting a shadow in the early light that makes the whole field appear to breathe. The ridges are a foot high in places, 2 feet in others. They have been there for 500 years. You could walk across them without knowing what they are. Each ridge is a house. Not the memory of a house, not a symbol. The actual physical presence of a building that stood on that ground, the compacted earth of its floor, the rubble of its walls, the weight of its existence pressed into the soil by centuries of grass growing over it, and seasons cycling through it, and rain working its way down through everything. The ridge does not represent the house. It is the house, in the only form the house has left. There are 40 of them on the slope above the church, 2 more, larger, where the manor houses stood. And running between them, worn a foot deep into the chalk by centuries of feet and cartwheels, the hollow way, the main lane of Warham Percy, still holding its shape in the ground, still going where it always went, from the upper fields down to the mill, even though the mill is gone and the fields are grass, and the feet that wore it down have been dead for 5 centuries. The Hilton family demolished the last houses around 1500. The grass grew back, the ridges formed. And then nothing disturbed them, no plow, no building project, no landscaping commission, and so they are still there, in the particular stillness of things that have been preserved not by care, but by irrelevance. Nobody thought to remove them, because nobody thought anyone would look. Agnes was wrong. Someone is looking. In the churchyard at Warham Percy, archaeologists have excavated the bones of nearly 700 people. Children who died young, some in infancy, some at 5 or 7 or 10, at ages when the body is still growing, and a bad winter or a failed harvest can simply end things. Women whose skeletons are more muscular and more heavily built than city women of the same era, because they spent their lives doing the work, that a body doing that work, all its life becomes. Men who survived tuberculosis and kept plowing. People who were breastfed for 2 years as infants. which the isotope analysis in their bones still records, because their mothers knew the way. People who live close to the margin of survival always know that 2 years of breast milk was the difference between a child who lived and a child who didn't. These people have no names in any surviving document. The legal records that defined their status, their rights, their obligations, the documents that would have told us who they were exactly the kinds of records that rebels burned in 1381. Trying to free themselves from the grip of a written law that had been used against them for generations, the records burned, the bones stayed. And the bones tell a story that no document does, not a story of poverty or passivity or the faceless suffering of the medieval poor. A story of people who worked hard enough to change the shape of their skeletons, who fed their children long enough to give them a fighting chance, who survived things that should have killed them and kept going, who built a world's strips, commons, church, mill, lane, the whole intricate architecture of a civilization built for survival that lasted 600 years on that particular piece of ground. 600 years on the same ground. The same families, or families that replaced them, generation after generation, working the same strips, ringing the same bell, burying their dead in the same churchyard, maintaining the same rights by the same customs that needed no written record because they had never needed one before. Baron Hilton demolished their houses in about 1500. By 1543, 1,200 sheep grazed where the houses had stood. The ridges formed, the bones stayed. There is a footpath that runs through the site of Warham Percy now. The Yorkshire Wolds Way, a long-distance national trail that walks from the Humber estuary to the sea at Filey, passes directly through the village. On a summer weekend, there are walkers with dogs, families with children, people who have driven from towns and cities to spend a day in what they understand, correctly, to be one of the most beautiful landscapes in England. Some of them know what they are walking through, most of them don't. They walk across the ridges without registering them. They photograph the ruined church because it is picturesque, a genuinely beautiful ruin in a genuinely beautiful valley. The kind of image that has been painted and photographed so many times, it has become a visual shorthand for something ancient and permanent. They do not necessarily know that the church is standing alone because the village it served was demolished. They do not necessarily know that the valley they are walking through is the outcome of a decision made 500 years ago by a man who wanted more pasture for his sheep. They feel something, the particular quality of stillness that very old places carry, the sense of being somewhere that has absorbed more history than any single visit can hold, and they take a photograph, and they walk on. This is not ignorance, it is the success of the design. The landscape was made to feel ancient and natural and complete in itself, and it does, because 5 centuries of grass and weather have done what Capability Brown spent his career trying to do by engineering, made the human history invisible, made the absence feel like presence, made the silence feel like peace. But the ridges are still there, and once you have seen them, once you know what the long, slow waves in the grass mean, once you have understood that each one is a compressed and permanent record of a life that was lived there and then removed, you cannot walk across an English field in the right light without looking. You cannot see a lone church tower standing in a meadow without asking where the congregation went. You cannot admire the rolling hills and the serpentine lakes and the specimen trees of an English country estate without knowing, now, what the land looked like before the lake was made, and what happened to the people who lived in the ground it covers. The countryside is not empty. It was never empty. Under the grass, under the lakes, under the most celebrated landscape in the Western world, there are 3,000 communities pressed into the earth, still holding their shape, each one a world. Each one cleared, each one made invisible by the same process that made the countryside beautiful. Thomas More watched the beginning of this process in 1516 and reached for the most extreme image available. The sheep are devouring the men. He was right. The sheep came. the men were gone. The poets arrived and called it paradise. The paradise is real. The beauty is real. England's countryside is genuinely, extraordinarily beautiful. That beauty does not cancel what is underneath it. It coexists with it above the ridges, above the bones, above the hollow ways, and the extinguished rights, and the 300 years of suppressed revolution. The beauty and the crime exist in the same ground, at the same time, and always have. The only question is whether you are walking across the surface or reading what is underneath it. The last full-time residents of Warham Percy left in 1974. The farm cottages at the bottom of the valley, the ones that had been built from the stone of the medieval farmyard, occupied continuously since the 18th century, were finally vacated, and the site was taken into the guardianship of what is now historic England. The graveyard at the church received burials until 1900, long after the village was gone, long after anyone lived there. Families from the surrounding parishes brought their dead to Warham Percy because the church was still consecrated, still the official parish church of a place that no longer existed as a place. The last person buried there was not buried in a village. They were buried in a field. Think about that for a moment. The people who cleared Warham Percy did not clear the obligation to bury there. The churchyard kept receiving the dead for 400 years after the last house came down. 400 years of funerals in an empty valley, attended by people who had to walk down the same hollow way that Agnes walked, past the outlines of houses that had been grass since their great-great-grandparents were children. 400 years of grief in a place that was supposed to have been erased. The earth refused to cooperate completely. Walk back up out of the valley. Take one more look at the field. The ridges are still there in the morning light, running in their long parallel lines across the slope. Each one the compressed memory of something that was built here and lived in here, and then taken apart so that sheep could stand where the walls had been. 500 years of grass have not flattened them. 5 centuries of weather have not smoothed them out. The ground still holds the shape of the people who shaped it. This is what the grass remembers. Not the lords, not the legislation, not the enclosure acts and the legal instruments, and the names of the men who made the calculation about wool prices and signed the orders and paid the mercenaries and hired the landscape gardeners and commissioned the paintings. Those names are in the documents, for anyone who wants to find them. What the grass remembers is the other names, the ones that are not in any document. The woman who woke before the bell rang and went to feed her goats in the dark. The man who walked this hollow way every morning for 40 years and wore it a little deeper with every step. The children who measured themselves against a doorframe that is now a ridge in a field. The people who survived the plague and the bad harvests and the rising rents and the slow removal of everything that had made their survival possible, and who chose generation after generation, for 300 years to fight for it rather than accept it. The grass keeps all of it. It always has.